Good afternoon. I'm delighted to speak here today on the subject of writing history. I'm especially pleased because I'm here in the Linhall Library. I became a member of the library in the 1970s. In 1979, I became a governor, and I took part in the campaign to save the library. Looking at the vibrant state of the library today, it is hard to believe that 40 years ago, the future of this library was in question. There were serious questions about its survival. The days of the library looked numbered. The building was in poor condition. Membership numbers had dropped, partly because the troublesome people weren't coming to Belfast. And so finances were in a very poor state. There were suggestions 40 years ago that the library should be closed and the books all moved to Queen's. Fortunately, there were a spirited few, in particular Margaret Garner and Brian Traynor, who were resolutely opposed to closing the library. This would have been the end of 200 years tradition, and they really would not stand for that. New governors were elected and a campaign was launched to save the Linhall Library. This rescue began with a well-attended meeting in the City Hall, followed by a successful appeal to the government, to the City Council and the citizens of Belfast for moral and financial support. Membership grew, the finances improved, and the library took on a new lease of life as the main cultural centre in downtown Belfast. Many people played a part in this campaign. I would mention especially Jennifer Campbell. I served as president in 1995 to 98 and remained a governor until the early 2000s. As a governor for over 30 years. Now, it used to be long service like that was seen as very virtuous. But more recently, however, people would look askance at that and say this was bad practice. Anyhow, I was delighted to be able to serve in the library for 30 years. For me, of course, my early connections with the library were not just being involved in the Board of Governors, but they're having access to this wonderful collection of books. As my interests were both historical and literary, especially relating to Ulster and the rest of Ireland, the collections of the library were a great source for my reading and research. Besides the modern books, the library had wonderful collections of maps, photographs, newspapers, early printed material, and recent political writings and ephemera. In my work in history, the library was an essential place to visit. The staff of the library always made me feel very welcome and greatly assisted me to find the material I wanted. So I'm very grateful to the library. My father was a Church of Ireland rector, first at Saul and Inch, near Downpatrick, then at Ballinhinch, and finally at Knockbreda. I was sent to boarding school at Sentry Hill and Campbell College. Until the age of 16, I wanted to be a medical doctor, but I was no good at the sciences, so that was a real problem. I suddenly realized that I actually really liked history and literature. I was much better at these. Until the 1960s, there was little Irish history taught in the Northern Ireland curriculum, but of course in Henry Gradlin's times was introduced at A-level. In my final years at Campbell College, the Reverend Liam Barber came as a Presbyterian chaplain to the school. He was also a fine historian who taught the Henry Gradlin course. Thanks to him, I developed a deep interest in Irish history. I might say I spent my early childhood in Ballinhinch, the place where the great battle was fought in 1798. But growing up, I knew nothing about it. Perhaps if I'd lived in the rectory, in the manse, rather than the rectory, I would have known about it. At the same time, my father had been a chaplain, D-Day 1 in Normandy, where he'd been part of the greatest battle ever fought in Western Europe. So it may be that the Battle of Ballinhinch didn't register with him. Anyway, he was completely opposed to all battles, so perhaps that's why it wasn't talked about. Anyway, after Campbell, I went to Magee College, Derry, Londonderry, and then Trinity College, Dublin. I was taught by a range of great historians, including Bob Hunter, Leslie McCracken, Brendan MacDowell, and Theo Moody. Now, I give you their Christian names, but of course in those days I wouldn't have dreamt addressing them personally by their Christian names. After I graduated, in 1970, I moved to postgraduate research in Trinity under the supervision of Theo Moody. My work was on parliamentary politics in Ulster, 1868 to 86. I finished this PhD in 1976. During this time, I was engaged for 2 years by the New History of Ireland to edit a volume of Irish election results, 1801 to 1922. Eventually, this was followed by a second volume, 1921 to 1990. I was fortunate to be awarded a junior fellowship at the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's. I taught for a year in the History School at Liverpool University, 1976 to 7. Then I was appointed to a lectureship in the Politics School at Queen's. Here I joined a cohort of very distinguished historians, including John White, Con O'Leary, and later Paul Bew and Margaret O'Callaghan. In 1987, I became Assistant Director of the Interdisciplinary Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's under Roddy Buchanan. In 1993, I was appointed Director of the Institute. When the Institute was reorganized, I returned in 2002 to the Politics School, where I remained until my retirement in 2012. My time at the Politics School was actually very important for my historical research, because I had to teach about politics in Europe and the origins of modern party systems. So this broadened my outlook, I'm glad to say. This gave me an extra aspect to my work in Irish history. I found this European dimension a valuable means to help understand developments in Ireland. I'll say a little bit more about this later. As I've explained, my main academic interest in history lay in the field of electoral politics. At the same time, in those early decades, I explored other dimensions of our history. In the early 1970s, I thought it worth looking at developments in Ulster in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through the work of contemporary writers and photographers. This became a book called Faces of the Past, a photographic and literary record of Ulster life 1880 to 1915. I couldn't find a publisher for this book, but fortunately I met a printer, John D. Murphy, who decided to take on it as his first work as a publisher. He wanted to become a publisher. The book came out in 1974. It was beautifully designed with well-blended literary extracts with photographs. It got great reviews, not only in the local press, but also in The Guardian and the Irish Times. John then went on to develop his successful publishing firm, the Apogee Press. This book continued in publication fairly recently. I have a copy of it, printed in Egypt in 1998. Now, this does not reflect an idea that my books are read internationally. It's just that it was printed in Egypt. But still, I was pleased to see it, and it's still available, I believe, until recently. 2 years later, John published a second book of mine, Shadows on Glass, a portfolio of early Ulster photography containing the works of 13 photographers reflecting different ways of life. To me, these photographic records are a very important source for revealing our history. New printing methods meant that the photographs could be printed cheaply and easily in book form, and so made available to a wide audience. Before this time, the publication of photographs was an expensive process, which limited their use. But now, text and images could be blended together in a very attractive form. During my research into these photographers, I discovered the work of William F. Mckinney, a farmer from Carnmoney, County Antrim. What was unusual was that in the late 19th and early 20th century, this farmer photographed everyday life at his farm and neighborhood, something which very few photographers did at the time. I then visited his home at Sentry Hill, Carnmoney, where his grandson, Dr. Joe Dundee, had recently taken up residence. This house and its contents had survived in virtually unchanged form from the death of Mckinney in 1920 and his grandson in 1916 at the Somme. After those two deaths, it remained in the possession of other members of the family, and they kept it very much as it had been, unchanged. And so when I arrived there in the late 1970s, it was a treasure trove of letters, diaries, photographs, etc., as well as furniture and other features of material culture. Joe Dundee asked me to write a history of the family and house. This became a book, Sentry Hill, an Ulster house and family, published in 1982 by Blackstaff Press. Sentry Hill is now a major heritage centre run by Newton Abbey Council. I think this book gives an insight into the whole Ulster Scots tradition. I've become aware of the photographs of the commercial photographer Robert French, who worked for the Dublin firm of W.M. Lawrence, and his collection is now in the National Library of Ireland in Dublin. He covered virtually every village, town and city in Ireland at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. I selected a range of photographs for Belfast and organised them as a book. I then involved a friend, Hugh Dixon, an architectural historian, in researching and writing up the photographs. This resulted in a book under both our names, published in 1985, called No Mean City, Belfast 1880 to 1914 in the photographs of Robert French. The following year, we produced a book on an earlier collection called In Belfast Town, early photographs in the Lawrence collection, 1864 to 1880. These photographs were a very unusual source. They were from the National Library, from the Lawrence collection, but they were part of the collection that really hadn't been used. They were the Stereoscopic Collection. That's a collection of stereoscopic views. That's the two views seen at once through a little sort of camera. And no one had really used these before. And I discovered there were some really rare photographs of Belfast before 1880. So that's what led to the second book. Now, both these books were published by Friars Blues Press, which is a publishing venture I set up and ran from the front room of my home in College Park Avenue. I might say when I set up this press, I wasn't quite sure what to call it. I lived near the Ormeau Road, so I thought, well, why don't I call it the Ormeau University Press, or OUP for short, which might cause wonderful confusion, which the well-known Oxford University Press. But in the end, I decided not to go for that, and I called it Friars Blues Press after the name of that famous ancient graveyard at Stranmillis. The press, which later involved editors Margaret McNulty and Jane Crosby, then went on to publish some 60 books on architectural history, local history, and early photographers. Of course, I continued with my academic research and publications. I wrote my thesis, which came out in 1986, Ulster Politics of Formative Years, 1986-86, published by the Ulster Historical Foundation. My second volume of lecture results appeared in 1990. In 1995, I was co-author with Alf McCreary on the history of Queens. By the 1990s, however, I was based at the Institute of Irish Studies, where my historical interest developed in new ways. During this decade, the Institute was an exciting interdisciplinary centre where a lot of innovative research was taking place. The early 19th century Ordnance Survey memoirs for Ulster were being described and edited for publication by Angelique Day and Patrick McWilliams. Peter Francis was conducting groundbreaking work into Irish ceramics and glass. Jane Leonard was working on commemoration of the First World War and other events. Visiting Canadian historian Don Akinson continued his research into the Irish diaspora. Don's work on the diaspora gave me an interest in the subject. And the interest of the Institute in this topic became quite well known. So in 1995, I was actually contacted by President Mary Robinson, who was planning to produce or give a groundbreaking lecture and talk on the Irish diaspora. There's a possibility it might have come to Queen's, to the Institute, but in the end she gave it in the Irish Parliament in Dublin. And I was invited as a guest on that occasion, and I was greatly honoured. During this decade, I produced 2 collections of essays, Dancing to History's Tune, History, Myth and Politics in Ireland, and Past and Present, History, Identity and Politics in Ireland. A major concern in these books was how we remember and commemorate our history. They were published by the Institute, and I was able to select 2 brilliant front covers, one by John Luke and the other by Brian Ferran. Let me show you one by John Luke. You'll probably recognize this wonderful picture, the original which is in the Ulster Museum. You recognize that? Yes. It's a wonderful picture. The Institute ran its own very successful publishing house, and under editors Kate Newman and Margaret McNulty, some 120 books were published, many dealing with history. I returned to the politics school at Queen's in 2002. I continued with my broad research interests. I became a joint general editor, along with the late Bob Welch, of the Oxford History of the Irish Book. 3 volumes have already appeared, and 2 more are due shortly. I researched and wrote up a number of articles on the Irish diaspora as well as the Irish famine. A political history of the 2 Irelands from partition to peace was published in 2012. This was based on my work in the politics school on political identity in Ireland, and that book came from that. I argued in this book that after 1921, prescriptive, exclusive and confrontational ideas of identity developed in the 2 jurisdictions in Ireland, which helped to lead to conflict and violence in 1968 and to inhibit meaningful accommodation of the different sides. I looked at both majority and minority sections over the period from 1921 to the present. In recent years, however, as I pointed out, more inclusive and pluralist concepts of identity have evolved, which have allowed for a substantial degree of accommodation. That book was published in 2012. I left Queen's that year. Since then, I've continued to research and to publish. I was co-consultant editor of Illustrated History of the Church of Ireland. I wrote a history of St. George's Church in downtown Belfast, published in 2016 by the Ulster Historical Foundation. This is a beautiful book, and I was glad to work again with the designer Wendy Dunbar on its design. This leads me to my latest book. It is called Irish History Matters, Politics, Identities and Commemoration, and was published last year by History Press. Sorry, the lettering's upside down, but it gives an idea. Now you can see from that there's a nice picture on the front. It is actually a painting by William Connor called Polling Day, County Antrim, 1908. And I'm the owner of that painting. I bought it when I was 18, and I was delighted to be able to use it for this book. When I was 18, I studied art for the first time at school, loved the French Impressionists, and then I was downtown one day and saw the artworks of William Connor. I thought, marvelous, just like the French Impressionists. And of course, he'd been to Paris in the early 20th century. So I bought one of his paintings. I paid £20 for it from some of my savings my family put aside for me over the years. When I brought it home, my parents nearly fainted. No one in our family had ever paid £20 for a painting. But I'm glad to say I still have it, and let's say it's worth a little bit more than £20, so I was pleased about that. Anyway, the book is entitled Irish History Matters. It brings together my historical interests over the last 3 decades. Some essays were published before, but others are new. There are a number of sections. As I say, the book is entitled Irish History Matters. This can be viewed, this title can be viewed in 2 ways, both as a noun and a verb. First, it reflects how the chapters in the book examine matters of Irish historical interest. The subtitle, Commemoration, Identities and Politics, indicates the topics covered in the book. Secondly, and more importantly, the title reveals that our major concern in the book is how and why history matters in Ireland, why it is important in Ireland. The opening chapter is called The Past and the Present. History, Identity, and the Peace Process. Over the years, I have tracked how history, ideas of history, have impacted on current politics in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. I look here in this chapter at the way history, or more correctly, views of the past, historical perceptions, or historical myths have influenced the present in Ireland. In October 1996, the South African church leader Michael Cassidy said, following a visit to Ireland, "One notices how people are gripped by the past, remembering the past, feeding the past." He concluded that these realities of the past feed into the present in Ireland more than anywhere I have been. End of quote. In my opinion, these views served in part to cause and sustain the Troubles, which ran for 3 decades from the late 1960s until the late 1990s. Of course, what lay at the root of the conflict was not history, but modern day problems, particularly over nationality and also over religion. At the same time, ideas of ancient enmities served to significantly influence how people understood and expressed these matters. They encouraged enmity, they encouraged fatalism. Eventually, many of these historical perceptions were challenged, which helped to allow important reconciliation and to promote the peace process. New ideas of revised history and shared history aided these changes. Such historical views and the way they have altered are explored here in this chapter. Another section is called Politics 1885 to 1923. A chapter looks at the 1885 general elections, and I call it the 1885 6 general elections, a milestone in Irish history. I look at how in these years, modern unionist and nationalist parties, linked to denomination divisions, were formed and became the basis for 20th century political systems in Ireland, North and South. This is based on my original research on 19th century politics. However, the chapter benefits from my time in the politics school. Why were these years so important for the modern era? I offer some answers. Political scientists emphasize these years. This was when the franchise was significantly widened, when people could read and write for the first time, and modern political parties were established. In many other countries in Europe, this was the period, this is the key formative time in the emergence of modern political systems. The key sources of political division in Ireland were over nationality and religion. Now, sometimes we think our politics are unique, but many other European countries have been divided over these issues. Holland was divided over religion until not very long ago. Politics in other countries has been divided over nationality. It's a particular combination we have of these divisions that has created special problems for us. Another chapter in this section is called Southern Protestant Voices during the Irish Civil War and the War of Independence. Reports from Church of Ireland synods. This chapter looks at the fate of Southern Protestants, 1919 to 23, a subject which has been ignored until recently and now a matter of some controversy. This piece was researched and written in my final years in the politics school at Queen's and really happened by chance. I was interested in the fate of Southern Protestants in my work on 20th century Irish politics. However, as I was working on that in Queen's, I had wonderful access to the Irish Times digital archive. This is a digital resource where you can type in names and dates and find things from the past very easily just from your own desk. I came across a report of a Southern Diocesan Synod of the Church of Ireland and realised here was a good source which no one had used before. Now, the Church of Ireland is divided up into dioceses. These diocesan synods met every year, and at the beginning of these sessions, the bishop would make a speech, and very often he'd refer to what was going on. So these were always reported in the Irish Times. To have found these without the help of the Irish Times archive would have been very, very difficult and time consuming. But I only had to sit at my desk and tap in Mckinney Diocesan Synod, and the report would come up of the speech. And I was able to gather all these and analyse them and then produce an article which I think gives an insight into the experience of Southern Protestants. So here's an example of modern technology bringing the historian great access to sources. Another part is called Identities. Now, it's not called Identity, it's called Identities. And here I look at different forms of Irish identity and among the diaspora. I've long had an interest in this subject. My father was Belfast born, a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, and an army chaplain, D-Day veteran. He considered himself to be both a loyal British citizen stroke subject and also a proud Irishman. In the early 1900s, most people in Ireland, including Ulster Unionists, regarded themselves as Irish, but this is no longer the case. Today, relatively few Unionists in Northern Ireland consider themselves Irish. I examine the historical developments which caused this change and consider current trends in relation to Irish identity. A chapter follows then on the Irish abroad, and here I look at the great diversity among the diaspora of people who come from Ireland. I look at all those from Ireland, including those from a Protestant background who are often being ignored in such studies. The next chapter looks at the Irish in America, drawing special insights from the example of former President Barack Obama's Irish ancestry. I examine and explain how a majority of the 40 million of those who claim Irish ancestry are, surprisingly, Protestants. New information and the work of historians about the millions abroad with an Irish background have implications for identity in Ireland. It is clear that over the years and in different places, in Ireland and abroad, Irishness has been understood and expressed in many different ways. A final section deals with commemoration. I look at a number of commemorative events in Ireland. These tell us much about public awareness and celebration of our history. I examine how originally St. Patrick's Day and Armistice Remembrance Sunday were marked widely. They then became restrictive and are now once again shared events. Attention then focuses on the single identity events commemorated in the shape of the Siege of Derry, 1688-9, and Theobald Wolfe Tone. I look at how they've been recalled annually by the respective communities. This tells us a lot about our history, how we understand it, and also shows how our understanding of the history can have an impact on current events. Ian McBride has remarked, and I quote, "What is so striking about the Irish case is not simply the tendency for present conflicts to express themselves to the personalities of the past, but the way in which commemorative rituals have become historical forces of their own." I find these commemorations very interesting and surprising sometimes. The Siege of Derry, for example, 100 years after it happened, was celebrated in an ecumenical manner. In 1788, there was a service in St. Colum's Church around Cathedral, attended by the Catholic bishop and clergy, in which the siege was commemorated as a great victory for liberty for all. Now, in the course of the 19th century, it becomes seen simply as an event commemorating a Protestant event where Protestants see themselves having faced siege and then having enjoyed deliverance. It becomes a solely Protestant event. First of all, just for the citizens of Derry, it's only in 1885 that it's broadened and people from outside the city can join. But it's from the 1920s onwards, it becomes a major event when we thousands, in fact tens of thousands, attending this event, a really important event for many unionists. Now, in the 1960s, 1970s, there's controversy of these parades. But in recent times, what's interesting is that the people in Derry, Londonderry, have been able to mark this event in a non-confrontational way, which is interesting. First World War commemorations are also of great interest for two reasons. They show how we've been able to reclaim parts of our past that we've forgotten. Secondly, they show how these events can have a very reconciliatory effect. Two examples I'm going to give finally just to look at this. In the South, and for many nationalists, the First World War had been forgotten. Since the 1990s, however, great efforts to remember this event in an inclusive way were made north and south. In 2007, there's a photograph in the Irish Times which I think very much captured this and what effect it has had today. It was a photograph taken outside Galway Cathedral after an event to commemorate all those from Galway who died in the First World War. There were two people in the photograph. One was Eamon O'Keefe and the other was John Gorman. Now, who are these two people? Well, Eamon O'Keefe is a grandson of Eamon de Valera, who in 1916 occupied Boland's Mill in the name of the Republic and went on to become Taoiseach and president. John Gorman was an Ulster Unionist MLA. He was also the son of Major Jack Gorman, the last adjutant of the Royal Irish Constabulary Barracks in Phoenix Park, who in 1922 moved north for loyalty to the Crown and joined the RUC. So both these men had been there to commemorate all those from Galway who died in the war. And there they were standing together afterwards. And to me, this was a very symbolic image of the reconciliatory power of these commemorations. The other commemorative event I want to mention here is what happened in Enniskillen in 2018 on the anniversary of the 100 years since the armistice. Enniskillen was the first place in the United Kingdom on the 11th of November to mark the armistice in 1918. This is because there was a very alert telephonist in the army barracks, picked up a message that Marshal Foch sent to his troops at the front, saying that at midday today, or 11 o'clock, whatever it is, the war will end. So the telephonist woke up the rector. The rector then had the bells rung. So the bells in Enniskillen rang before bells anywhere else in the UK to celebrate the end of the First World War. Well, in 2018, there was a ceremony there to mark the event. And I was there along with a friend, Margaret O'Callaghan from Queen's. Very interesting. Mrs. Arlene Foster laid a wreath on behalf of the DUP party. She was no longer First Minister at that stage. Heather Humphreys, on behalf of the Irish government, laid a wreath. There was a parade afterwards then from the cenotaph to the cathedral. Members of the British Legion took part, you might have expected. But what you mightn't have expected was that veterans from the Irish Army were there, marching in their blue berets. So that just shows again how this event had this reconciliatory quality, which I think is worthy of note. So let me end on that. I'm conscious that today, or at this moment, we're entering into the second part of commemorations of things that happened 100 years ago. The first part of these commemorations from 1912 up to the present have been done in a very sensible and restrained manner, and there have been opportunities for reconciliation, opportunities for inclusive events. We now move into the period 1920 to 1923. This will be more difficult. There are events there that people will not want to share. There are events there that people will not be happy with. This will cause certain difficulty. However, I've been very impressed at the efforts people have made. Historians, members of the public have made an effort to deal with the past And as we go forward, I have every hope that that is exactly what we will do in the next 3 years. Thank you very much.